How Israel became rich while surrounded by enemies. In this video, we will focus solely on the economic history of Israel, without delving into the political and military issues that plague the region. The goal is to understand how in a few decades, a state surrounded by hostility became a global technological power. Now let's begin this journey to discover the Israeli economic miracle. If you find the video you watch useful, we invite you to subscribe to our channel and support us with a donation. Your help is precious to us and will allow us to continue producing quality content for you. You can do it here below, through the appropriate buttons, subscribe, and thanks. Israel, a small Middle Eastern country on the Mediterranean Sea with a population of 9.4 million people, has a surprisingly developed economy. There are not many advantages in the Israeli economy because there are many disadvantages. I am not expert enough or brave enough to speak about the geopolitical complexities of the region, but economies tend to do much better if they cooperate well with their neighbors. There are no direct cross-border trading partners, and a large portion of the national budget must be spent on defense. Although this is usually the best option, there are better alternatives, especially for raw materials that can be transported via pipelines, such as oil and gas. Moreover, Israel lacks both natural resources and arable agricultural land, and it does not have a large population available for low-cost production. In 2009, Israel spent more than 5% of its GDP on energy imports. This meant not only that the country was subject to the countries that provided this energy, many of which were not very favorable, but also that economic growth and competitive industry would be difficult in a situation where so much capital was literally being expatriated just to keep the lights on. Despite these difficulties, however, Israel remains one of the richest and most developed economies in the world, with production more than 10 times that of neighboring countries and higher than that of Canada, Germany, France, and the United Kingdom, among others. The Israeli economy is still plagued by several problems: political instability, stagnant economic growth, high inflation, and lack of confidence in the economy. These problems are very difficult to solve, but Israel has solved them, becoming a very useful case study for many economists in today's world. How did Israel recover from a complete economic failure? What drove its economic development, and how did it become one of the richest countries in the world? Can this success story be replicated in other countries that today face similar challenges? And finally, is this economic success story destined to end? The Israeli economy of today began in the mid-1980s. At that time, Israel was suffering from an annual inflation rate of over 350%. Most citizens began spending foreign currency, such as US dollars, but this was problematic. From a macroeconomic perspective, using a foreign currency means that the government loses control over almost everything. If taxes are increased in dollars, it admits that its own currency has no value. On the other hand, if it increases taxes in shekels, it will end up with only a quarter of the purchasing power it had a year ago and will be forced to make up the difference with further money creation. The role of the central bank is to stop this vicious circle by controlling the money supply and raising interest rates to maintain the value of the currency. Unfortunately, this only works if the central bank can act independently of the government. In the last 2 years, Turkey has had a severe inflation problem, far exceeding the high levels recorded by most countries in the world. The Turkish central bank has tried to slow down inflation at least by increasing interest rates, but the Turkish government has repeatedly forced it to lower them. The idea is that if companies pay less interest on their loans, they will be able to grow faster and create more jobs, thus countering the problem of inflation. This theory is not entirely wrong. If economic production increases faster than the money supply, there will be more new goods and services than units of currency, so more goods and services can be purchased per unit of currency, leading to deflation. A little inflation is also a good thing because it encourages people to spend and invest their money and maintain its value. Unfortunately, what governments in these situations do not realize is that higher inflation can, in itself, weaken economic growth. Some contracts with companies can last for years, and when a company wants to hire an employee, the first thing it wants to know is how much it will be paid for its work. Formal long-term contracts of this type become impossible when the value of the currency depreciates unpredictably and rapidly. In fact, if the currency can buy only 1/5 of what it was at the time of signing the contract, an excellent contract now could be a terrible contract in the future. In reality, inflation above 5% does more harm than good. The inflation rate of 370% in Israel in 1984 was a real problem, but most citizens avoided it simply by not using the currency. Stability and confidence are among the most important things in economics, and no one, neither inside nor outside of Israel, had confidence in the stability of the currency and, by extension, of the economy as a whole. Changing this situation was the first and most difficult step the government had to take to rebuild the country. In 1985, Israel introduced a new currency to replace the shekel, which had become virtually worthless, and gave it the incredibly imaginative name of the new Israeli shekel. The introduction of the new currency did not solve the problem of persistent inflation on its own. The government had to convince citizens to use this currency instead of doing business with the more recognized and stable US dollar. To convince citizens to use the new currency, it was necessary to give them certainty that they would not have the same problems as the old currency. It is interesting to note that the old shekel was technically replaced by the new Israeli shekel for only 5 years, from 1980 to 1985. The new shekel was to be a new beginning and was announced in parallel with the Israeli government's economic stabilization plan to relaunch the economy. Israel presented a 5-point plan, in theory simple. First, the government cut excessive spending. If the government injects money into the economy through social subsidies, public employment, and large infrastructure projects, consumer demand will increase because more people will have more money. Reducing spending means that those who previously earned from these sources will no longer be able to earn, and businesses that previously earned will have more difficulty generating revenue. If a currency becomes a scarcer resource, all else being equal, it will also become more valuable. Today, while countries around the world struggle with the problem of inflation, much attention is focused on the monetary policy of central banks, but many do not realize that public spending and taxation are just as important because they increase or decrease the money supply, which is a key component of inflation. Second, as in most developed countries in the world, the Central Bank of Israel was made completely independent of the government. While the central bank and the government usually have the common goal of overall economic prosperity, the bank's ability to act independently means that it can intervene and raise interest rates or stop money creation, even if the country's leaders are convinced of doing the opposite. After cutting spending and granting independence to the central bank, the Israeli government allowed the shekel to depreciate on the international currency market and then temporarily fixed a new depreciation rate. Depreciating its own currency was an interesting move. In fact, if a country depends on imports, inflation increases. Having to spend more of its own currency to buy the same amount of goods is the definition of inflation. However, the main task of governments at the time was not to control inflation, but to convince citizens to spend their own currency. If people could exchange the US dollar they were using for a reasonable amount of new currency, they would be more likely to adopt it, which would be a valid compromise, even if inflation was higher for the first 5 years. By the late 1980s, inflation had returned to a reasonable level, and most internal transactions were again conducted in the country's currency. The stabilization program worked, and still today many countries can adopt the same measures to get out of similar problems. For Israel, however, this allowed it to realize its full potential. In 1987, after the stabilization of inflation, Israel's GDP per capita was $9,000, less than half that of the United States at the same time. It was not bad, but in the 3.5 decades that followed, Israel would significantly close the gap. The first turning point was the discovery of offshore natural gas. Until then, the country had been heavily dependent on energy imports, but this made self-sufficiency possible. However, becoming an economically dependent fossil fuel producer on the export of natural resources was not enough. Israel also benefits from tourism. Israel has a number of important tourist destinations for different religions. In the past years, Israel has received more than 4 million tourists a year, but in recent years it has been hit by greed. This means that almost 1 tourist for every 2 inhabitants visits the country, bringing in many revenues from abroad and creating many jobs in a country with less than 10 million inhabitants. Normally, tourism alone represents a significant portion of a country's gross economic production, but in Israel it represents only 2% of the total GDP. Israel's true resource is its highly intelligent population. Today, Israel spends twice as much on research and development as a technological superpower like the United States. This allows Israel to develop world-leading industries and add a lot of economic value within its borders. Israel is one of the world's leading producers of advanced semiconductors. It is also one of the world's leading producers of weapons systems, given the need to have a strong army. One of its main imports is rough diamonds, which are cut and turned into jewelry and sold with wide margins. Not many people buy missile defense systems. Moreover, companies are small but numerous. Samsung's sales alone represent 20% of South Korea's GDP, and if the economy heavily depends on the performance of a single company, the economy becomes unstable. In addition, many European and North American companies have established production plants and high-technology research centers in the country to ensure a small but well-educated workforce in Israel. The Arabic word, valley, means innovation, comparable to Silicon Valley, the world center of technological innovation. Unfortunately, for other countries seeking to emulate Israel's success, it is not so simple to become a global center of innovation and technology. Israel was able to develop these industries thanks to a program launched after the economy took off, which encouraged innovation through direct government investment in promising industries. In itself, this is not a new idea. Taiwan is a global center for chip production thanks to direct government investment and support from companies like TSMC. However, it can be said that Israel has done the same thing even better. Public investments in profitable institutions have always been difficult because there is too much room for corruption, and public funds end up in the hands of those who pay the right bribes. Israel is not immune to corruption. During the economic recovery, it was a bit of a gamble to entrust responsible investments to the private sector, while the government tried to convince the public to trust its currency. The solution adopted in the end was a hybrid approach that encouraged private investors to finance Israeli assets with their own money, in exchange for generous tax breaks and zero-interest loans from the government to increase the return on their funds. This meant that investors still took risks to ensure that their money was not used irresponsibly, but it made Israel a very attractive place to invest and start a business. The best part is that these loans were repaid, so the Israeli government was able to build advanced industries at no real cost. In the 1990s, the government expanded this strategy to use the technical skills acquired by nearly 1 million scientists, engineers, and doctors from the former Soviet Union who emigrated to Israel after the collapse of the Union. Once again, this does not take into account all the geopolitical issues, which cannot be scratched in a single video. The fact that, despite these difficulties, it has managed to become one of the most prosperous economies in the world is a wonderful sign that even countries that today face serious difficulties have hope of building a better future for their citizens through good economic management. Now it's time to put Israel on the economic list and explain it. To start with the size, Israel's GDP is $488 billion, making it the 29th economy in the world after Ireland and Norway. Its score is 7 out of 10. It is certainly not a trillion-dollar economy, but its production is distributed over a population of only 9.5 million people, giving it a stunning GDP per capita of $52,000, higher than that of countries such as Canada, Germany, Japan, and even Hong Kong. It is the 15th most productive country in the world, but it is still far from extremes like the United States and Luxembourg. In other words, it gets a score of 8 out of 10. Stability and confidence are difficult to assess because of the geopolitical issues that everyone will always have in mind when doing business with Israel. Especially in the last 30 years, Israel has managed to rebuild its image, and people have become more confident in investing in the country. So far, it has scored 6 out of 10, which clearly is not bad. Growth has been very strong, thanks to everything I have described in this video. The average annual growth rate is just under 7%, comparable to some of the fastest growing economies in the world. In just the last decade, production has almost doubled, giving it a score of 9 out of 10. Finally, Israel excels in terms of industry. It has fully exploited its population to create a diverse range of world-leading and high-value-added industries, from diamond cutting and trading to the production of cutting-edge computer chips. In summary, in terms of the size of its economy, Israel cannot compete with superpowers like China or the United States. Nevertheless, it has built a solid and highly competitive industrial sector at the global level, which we rate 8 out of 10. All this adds up to a final score for Israel of 7.6 out of 10, very respectable, which puts it high on our list. What was your experience with the topic covered in this video? Tell us about it in the comments, we are curious to know. And if you have any doubts or questions, don't hold back. Leave a comment, even just a simple like would be perfect, but most importantly, subscribe to the channel to stay informed about upcoming releases.